The forest on New Terra did not make noise the way forests should have. There were no birds, no insects, no wind in the leaves, only the occasional creak of bark under tension and the soft breath of moss expanding after rain. Kael Carter liked that silence was a language he had learned to speak fluently. It had been 3 years since he last heard a voice that wasn't his own. 3 years since the outpost collapse. 3 years since command stopped answering and he stopped asking. Now he lived between roots and shadow, an engineer without purpose, a survivor without destination. And then came the sound he could not ignore. It wasn't loud, not sharp, just wrong. A soft whimper, like breath struggling through wet leaves, a sound too light to be beast, too organic to be wind. He froze, crouched by the stream, listening again. There it was, closer now. Kael moved slowly, keeping low through the thick ferns, his boots silent against the damp earth. Every motion deliberate, every muscle listening. He found it near the edge of a shallow ravine where the earth had split weeks ago after a quake. It was curled beneath a cluster of thorn brush, tiny trembling blood, matting one side of its silvery skin. At first he thought it was a child, then maybe a bird, then something else entirely. It had no fur, only soft textured skin that shimmered faintly in the dim light. 2 large eyes half-lidded, not blinking, only watching. A cut ran across its flank, deep but not mortal. Kael's breath caught in his throat. Whatever this thing was, it was not native to New Terra. He had seen creatures engineered for war parasites, bred for harvest bio-beasts used in off-world colonies. But this was something older, smaller, sadder. He reached forward slowly, palms open, voice quiet. Hey, it flinched but did not flee. Kael saw now that one of its hind limbs was bent at an unnatural angle. Bone-exposed skin pulsing faintly around the wound. You're not going to make it out. Here are you. The creature blinked once. That was answer enough. He took off his outer jacket and draped it gently over the small body, careful not to touch the injury directly, then wrapped the edges beneath its belly, scooping it up as gently as possible. It was light, too light. Bones like hollow reeds beneath his hands. It made a sound, then not a cry, not a growl, just a breath against his chest as if it had memorized the sound of kindness. Kael carried it back through the forest, the silence heavier now pressing around him like the woods were holding their breath. Something watched from the tree line, but did not approach far above the canopy. A shadow moved too smooth, too precise to be cloud. A small drone blinked once and vanished into the dark. Kael didn't see it, but someone did, and they whispered across stars. A human has touched the sacred one, and the universe shifted. The storm came after sunset. It wasn't rain, but static. A low electric hum that rippled through the treetops, making the air smell like memory and old wires. The kind of storm that didn't soak but stirred, as if something unseen had begun to breathe just beneath the surface of the world. Inside the cabin, Kael moved quietly, setting the small creature, Elu, onto a folded blanket atop his workbench. The softest place he had. The rest of the room was metal and tool, scratch barely insulated from the cold. Elu made no sound, but its large eyes followed his every move, watching with something too deep to be fear, too quiet to be trust. Kael lit the lantern, slow flame, blooming against the cabin's damp walls, shadows dancing gently across Elu's silvery skin. He sat down across from it, resting his elbows on his knees, voice steady but low. I don't know what you are, but I know hurt when I see it. Elu blinked once, then again, each movement, like it was learning how to blink, not just doing it. Kael reached slowly into the medkit, pulled out gauze disinfectant, a field suture gun, and set them down piece by piece in front of him like an offering. I won't touch you if you don't let me. Just nod or don't flinch. Elu didn't move, but its eyes stayed open wide and still. That was permission enough. He leaned in slow, cleaned the wound with careful swipes, wrapped it in soft cloth. Each gesture as gentle as memory would allow. Elu's breathing slowed, as if something in the touch reminded it how to survive. Kael finished, then leaned back, wiped his hands and looked out through the small window. The storm hadn't reached them yet, but something had he could feel it, a presence beyond the trees, watching, waiting. Far above the canopy, a black ship hung in low orbit, silent, cloaked, shaped like a blade waiting to drop. Inside its control chamber stood Saralith Virel, heir to the Zerlin bloodline, eyes closed, one gloved hand, hovering over the glyph interface of the sacred link. She was pale as starlight wrapped in ceremonial silver, her crown braided into the bone of her hair. He touched it, she said, voice like ice across glass. One of them, a human, he touched Elu. The room fell still. None of her guards responded, because to speak would be to confirm the unthinkable. She opened her eyes slowly, violet fire shimmering beneath her lashes. I will go down alone. One of the guards stepped forward, hesitating. Princess, he should be punished, not seen. If he meant harm, Elu would be dead. And yet it lives more than that. It trusts, and I want to know why. Prepare the descent module. I will meet this Kael Carter, and I will see with my own eyes what makes a human worthy. The morning rose without birdsong, only the creak of frost tightening over the trees, and the soft whisper of wind bending through pines like a voice too old to name Kael, stood outside the cabin, staring up at the clearing above his roof, where the sky had begun to ripple, not with clouds but with gravity, the kind that bends silence and makes your heart beat faster for reasons your mind hasn't caught up to yet. He heard it before he saw it. A low hum, not mechanical but resonant like a bell forged in a language not meant for metal. The ship appeared slowly unfolding through the sky, like a tear in velvet, not descending but choosing a place to exist and becoming part of it. It hovered for a moment above the clearing, matte black with veins of pale silver pulsing across its skin, then settled with impossible grace, barely disturbing the earth beneath it. Kael didn't move. His hand rested near the old plasma tool at his belt, but he didn't draw it. Instinct told him what weapons could not. This was not something he could fight. The hatch opened without sound, and she stepped out. Tall, wrapped in light armor laced with ceremonial threads, eyes glowing faintly beneath a veil of silver cloth. Her presence more than regal, it was elemental like winter wind stepping into the shape of a woman. She walked forward, not fast, not slow, just inevitable. Kael's voice was steady but dry. You came for the creature. She stopped 3 paces from him, removed her veil with a single motion, and stared into him. I came for you. He didn't answer. Not right away. From the doorway behind him, Elu stepped into view, blinking slowly, still wrapped in bandage, still weak but standing. The moment Saralith saw Elu, her expression cracked. Just for a second, something like wonder or grief. You named it, Elu. Kael nodded once. It was the only sound it made when I found it. She walked past him, then without fear, without hesitation, and knelt before Elu, bowing her head lightly, touching the air before his chest. My light, she whispered. My bond, you are still breathing. Elu chirped once softly and stepped forward. Not to her, but back toward Kael, pressing gently against his leg. Saralith rose slowly, her gaze now sharp-focused, unsure. Why does it choose you? Kael shrugged. I didn't ask it to. It was bleeding, I helped. That's it. No one does that for Elu without expecting favor. Kael tilted his head. Then maybe no one deserves it. Her jaw tightened just slightly. You touched something sacred. You should have burned, but you didn't. He met her gaze. Maybe you've mistaken what sacred means. Silence fell again, but it was not empty. It was heavy. Charged between them stood something ancient and invisible. Trust that wasn't permission. Care that wasn't possession. Saralith looked at Elu again, then at Kael. I need to understand what happened here. You have 3 days, and if I refuse, then I stay longer. She turned and walked back toward her ship, paused, and without looking back said, He was bleeding. I helped. That's it. Is not a small thing. Then she vanished into the ship and the forest stood still. But Kael knew nothing would be quiet again. They brought him to the mouth of the labyrinth at twilight, when the last of the sun had bled through the canopy and the sky turned the color of quiet regret. It wasn't built of walls or stone. It was built of questions. Kael stood before a towering arch formed of roots and bone, where light bent inward and shadows whispered like voices too old to speak aloud. Sarilith stood beside him, her expression unreadable now. Not royal, not distant, but caught somewhere between reverence and concern. "You don't have to do this," she said. Kael looked at the threshold and back at her. "You already know that I will." She nodded once. "This place does not test strength, it tests truth. Those who lie to themselves vanish, and those who don't walk out changed." He adjusted the straps on his jacket one last time. "I'm not afraid of the truth." She touched his forearm lightly. "Then may it recognize you." Kael stepped through the arch and was gone. The world shifted, the light bent, and suddenly he stood in a forest that wasn't a forest. Paths spiraling in every direction, fog curling around his feet, each turn bleeding into the next like a memory you're trying not to forget. He took the left path because it felt like the kind of wrong that was right. It led him to a clearing where a figure knelt beside a broken child. The child was him. The figure was his brother dying again. Kael froze, heart pounding. Breath caught in his throat. The voice came not from either, but from the air. "Would you save him?" I tried. "That is not the question." Kael knelt slowly, tears stinging. "Yes, I would. Even if it changed nothing. Even if it broke me." Yes, the memory melted, the mist shifted. Now he stood in a field of flames where Sarilith bled from her chest and Elu curled beside her. Fading, the voice returned. "You can walk away and survive, or stay and die with them." Kael looked down at his hands. They were empty, but not weak. "I would stay, because living without them would mean forgetting why I chose to begin." The field vanished. This time the fog parted slowly, revealing only a mirror. Inside it stood no one. Nothing, just darkness. "This is what waits if you lie." Kael stepped forward without blinking. "Then let it come." He placed his hand on the mirror, and it shattered without sound. The light returned, and the world opened. He stood once more at the arch, Sarilith waiting, eyes wide, chest rising sharply. "You were gone for hours," she whispered. "It's only been minutes." Kael looked back. Inside the forest was stillness, but no longer silence. "You passed," she said. "You found the center." Kael shook his head. "No, it found me, and it forgave me." The priest scribes at the edge of the trees fell to their knees, not for Kael, but for the path that let him return. Sarilith stepped forward. "You've seen what most of my kind fear to face, and still you came back whole." He looked at her. Not whole, but honest. She smiled softly for the first time, not out of triumph, but belief. "Then you are ready for what Kael asked, for the part where everything that came before was the easy part." The council hall of Zeralon shimmered like a blade drawn under moonlight. Thousands gathered across marble tiers, lined in obsidian banners, staring down toward the central circle where judgment was spoken, and truth was supposed to echo louder than power. But truth rarely echoed unless someone dared to speak it first. Kael stood at the center, unarmed, outnumbered, and, for the first time, fully seen. His shoulders bore no insignia, his boots still caked in forest dust, and yet the room tilted toward him, not by decree, but by gravity of what he had survived. At the edge of the chamber, Sarilith stood silent, her hands folded beneath the ceremonial sleeves of her cloak, her gaze locked forward, her presence like a charged silence. Waiting across from Kael, draped in gleaming armor, stood General Van Maran, commander of the Eastern Legions, and uncle to the crown. He pointed one silver gauntleted finger toward Kael. "This off-worlder has manipulated the Sacred One, trespassed upon the ancient rites, and sought the favor of the heir with false humility." The crowd murmured, some in agreement, others in doubt. Kael didn't blink. "I didn't seek favor. I carried something hurt and helpless into shelter. That's not manipulation, that's decency." The general laughed, a harsh sound like stone breaking bone. "And now you presume to stand in this hall and speak as if you know our laws?" Kael's voice was calm. "I don't know your laws, but I know this. When power protects only itself, it is not tradition, it is fear." Gasps rippled across the tiers. The general's face darkened. "You dare insult this council?" "No, I'm reminding them what it used to mean, to serve something greater than themselves." Before the general could respond, Sarilith raised one hand, and the room obeyed. Her voice carried without force, only truth. The general accuses Kael Carter of seducing the sacred bond, of staging his survival, of falsifying the rites, and yet she turns slowly. I hold here the testimony of the Sacred One itself. Ilu appeared from behind the dais. Not walking but floating eyes glowing softly, body surrounded by a golden field of memory. Every voice fell silent. Ilu projected the past. Not words, not images, but feeling. The moment Kael bent to pick up the wounded body in the forest, the warmth of his arms, the steadiness of his voice, the silence of expectation in the absence of control. Then the vision of Sarilith watching Ilu choose Kael freely, and finally the memory of the trial, the fire beast Korra kneeling without being commanded. When the vision faded, no one moved until Sarilith stepped forward. You forged no manipulation, you forged meaning. And the general, she turned, has forged lies. The crowd erupted, not in chaos but clarity. Members of the inner circle rose in protest against the general, demanding investigation. He shouted, voice cracking, I protected this empire. You protected yourself, Sarilith answered, voice now royal and resolute. And in doing so, you forgot who the empire was. For guards moved fast. The general didn't resist, not out of honor, but because he knew he had already lost. As they led him away, Kael turned to Sarilith. I didn't come here to tear your world apart. You didn't, she said softly. You just reminded us what it meant to be whole. And the hall once a place of judgment became, for a moment, a place of renewal. The square of Eldereth had not seen a crowd like this in generations. Stone terraces overflowed with citizens, priests, warriors, even off-world envoys, all drawn not by ceremony, but by something rarer. Conviction, no banners flew, no horns sounded, and yet the silence was more profound than any anthem. In the center of the square stood Kael Carter, dressed in the same plain jacket he wore the day he found Ilu beneath the pines of New Terra. No medal on his chest, no sigil on his collar, just dirt beneath his boots, and the weight of having done the right thing when no one asked him to. Before him stood the crown princess Sarilith Virel, but today she wore no crown, only a simple robe of woven starlight, her hands bare, her voice unamplified. I was raised to believe that strength was purity, that legacy was law, and that no outsider could ever understand the sacred. She turned slowly, addressing not Kael, but the world watching. But he did without knowing, without asking. He honored what our warriors forgot, that sacredness does not need to be understood to be protected. It only needs to be seen. She stepped forward closer, then before the entire square. She knelt not as ruler, not as symbol, but as someone who had learned what humility looked like and chosen to reflect it. Gasps rippled like wind through the terraces. Ilu emerged beside Kael, walking now, whole restored, and gently placed its forehead against his hand. The priests did not speak. They did not need to, because the Sacred One had chosen not a prince, not a soldier, but a man who picked up something fragile and never expected it to owe him anything. Kael looked down at Sarilith, eyes wide. You don't have to kneel for me. She looked up, smiling faintly. I kneel for what you reminded me of, and what this empire forgot. She rose slowly, then extended her hand, not in command, but invitation. Stay, not as subject, not as consort, as voice as bridge. Kael stared at the outstretched hand, then took it. Not because he wanted power, but because he finally understood what could come from walking into a broken world and offering to listen. Together they stood, not above the crowd, but within it, and from the terraces came no roar. No applause, only quiet nods, and hearts beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, hope was not a ceremony, but a person who chose to act before anyone was watching. They would tell the story differently in every province. Some said he was a wandering healer who tamed a sacred beast. Others whispered that he was a ghost from the forgotten wars. A few believed he was no more than a quiet man with a steady hand who refused to walk away. But the one truth no one could rewrite was this. Kael Carter did not change the Zero Land Empire by raising his voice. He changed it by not lowering his gaze. He stayed not for titles, not for power, but because something small and wounded needed him, and when the Empire watched what came next, it changed. He became known not as a hero, but as the quiet flame, the one who carried light without needing it to burn. Children grew up learning the phrase, "What would Kael do?" And it never meant be perfect. It meant act with grace when no one's looking. It meant protect the fragile when it's not your responsibility. It meant choose the hard kindness when silence would be easier. In the years that followed, Elu remained by his side, no longer sacred because of myth, but sacred because it reminded people that trust is always a risk and always worth taking. Seralith ruled not with iron but with open hands, and when Kael walked beside her, he did so not behind, not above but beside. As storms passed and generations shifted, his name never left the walls, but his greatest legacy was never carved in stone. It was in the way people started helping strangers again, the way a child stopped to lift a fallen bird, the way a guard spared a moment to listen before raising a weapon. And when he was old and the days had grown quiet again, Kael sat beneath the trees of New Terra. Where it all began, Elu curled at his feet, eyes still bright, still watching. And Kael said softly to no one, "I didn't come to change anything. I just couldn't let it die alone." And across 1,000 stars, that one sentence kept echoing, a quiet answer to a loud world. If you found something fragile and no one was watching, would you still reach out? Would you still choose to protect even when no reward waits for you? Share your thoughts below and tell us what you would have done if you were Kael Carter.